Imagine a man counting down his final days with one heart-wrenching wish to see his beloved dog one last time. But when they finally reunite, what happens next leaves everyone speechless. A mystery, a bond stronger than death, and a revelation you'll never see coming. Stay tuned for the story that will touch your heart and shake your beliefs. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that keeps you on the edge of your seat. The air was heavy with smoke, thick and suffocating, as the young firefighter charged into the blazing house. His voice cut through the roaring flames as he called out, "Is anyone there?" The floor groaned under his boots, and a distant cry pierced the chaos, a child's desperate wail. He pushed forward, his vision blurred by heat and tears, but the barking guided him. A dog, lean and golden, emerged through the haze, its fur singed but its eyes sharp and focused. It barked again, signaling the direction of the cry. Together, they made their way to a small figure trapped beneath a fallen beam. The dog whined, clawing at the debris as the firefighter strained to lift it. The ceiling above cracked ominously, flames licking the wood. The sound of splitting timber echoed, then darkness. John woke abruptly, the memory fading like smoke in the wind. His frail chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. The sterile walls of his hospice room came into focus. He blinked, disoriented, clutching the thin blanket pulled up to his neck. A nurse entered, her footsteps soft, but John barely noticed. His hand reached instinctively to the nightstand, where a worn leather dog collar rested, a relic of years gone by. "Max," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "Where's Max?" The nurse offered a practiced smile. "You were dreaming again, Mr. Hayes. Can I get you anything?" He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the collar. The nurse left quietly, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His hand trembled as he picked up the collar, tracing the scratches on the worn leather. It had been 10 years since Max had disappeared. 10 long years. And now, as his body betrayed him and time ran out, the ache of that absence grew unbearable. The door creaked open again, but this time it wasn't the nurse. Claire stood there, her expression guarded. Her resemblance to her younger self was startling, though the years had etched lines of frustration and sadness into her face. John hadn't seen his daughter in years, not since their bitter argument on the day of her mother's funeral. "You called for me," she said simply, not stepping further into the room. John's throat tightened. He nodded. "I did." Claire crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "Why now?" He met her gaze, his eyes wet but unyielding. "Because I'm dying, Claire. And there's one thing I need before I go." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't come out of obligation. She'd come to see the man she had once loved unconditionally, the man who had chosen his career over their family time and time again. But now, seeing him reduced to this frail figure in a hospital bed, her anger warred with pity. "What is it?" she asked finally, her voice colder than she intended. "Max." His voice broke as he said the name. "I need to see him." Claire blinked. "Max? The dog you lost years ago?" John nodded, his hands clutching the collar like a lifeline. "He's out there, Claire, I know it." She sighed, exasperated. "Dad, Max has been gone for a decade. He's probably—" "Don't say it," John snapped, a sudden fire in his voice. "Don't you dare." Claire flinched. The strength in his tone surprised her, as if his will alone could defy the years that had passed since Max's disappearance. For a moment she hesitated, seeing the desperation in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about a dog. He was clinging to something bigger, a memory, a promise, a chance to make peace with himself. "Why Max?" she asked softly, the ice in her voice melting just slightly. "Why now?" John looked down at the collar, his thumb brushing over the metal tag engraved with the name. "He was always there for me, Claire, when no one else was. When I couldn't be there for you or your mother, Max was." The admission caught her off guard. Her father wasn't one for vulnerability, and yet here he was, unraveling before her. She leaned against the wall, her arms still crossed, but her stance less rigid. "And you think he's still alive?" John nodded, his gaze far away. "I don't just think, I know." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Claire wanted to argue, to push back against the absurdity of his request. But something in his eyes, something raw and earnest, stopped her. Against her better judgment, she asked, "Where do I even start looking?" John's lips twitched into the faintest smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Start where we lost him." Claire stood in the doorway of her father's room, arms crossed as the weight of his words pressed on her. Start where we lost him. She could still remember that day as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. A storm rolling in with ferocious winds, the sound of Max's bark cutting through the rain, and the sight of the golden retriever vanishing into the woods. She had been only 20, fresh from college, her heart still tender from her mother's passing. And John? He had been too consumed by his work to notice the storm building in their family, let alone the one outside. Claire exhaled deeply and left the room without another word, her emotions tangled. She needed air, needed space. The corridors of the hospice were quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes. Her thoughts raced as she stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter against the winter chill. Could she really do this? Searching for a dog who had been missing for 10 years? She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered over her partner's contact name, then moved to Sam, the man who had been her father's closest friend. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but if anyone could help make sense of this, it was Sam. The phone rang twice before his familiar gruff voice answered. "Claire, that you?" "Yeah, it's me," she said, her voice tentative. "I need to ask you something about my dad." "Your dad?" Sam sounded surprised. "I didn't think you two were still talking." Claire felt a pang of guilt, but pushed past it. "He's dying, Sam, and he's got this idea in his head. He wants me to find Max." Silence hung on the line for a moment before Sam replied, his tone cautious. "Max, huh? I figured he'd bring that up sooner or later." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sam said slowly, "your dad's never stopped thinking about that dog. He always believed Max was out there somewhere, waiting." Claire bit her lip. "Do you think there's any truth to it?" Sam's answer came after a long pause. "I don't know, Claire. That dog was something else, smartest animal I've ever seen. If any dog could survive out there for 10 years, it'd be Max." The weight of Sam's words settled on her chest. Max had always seemed larger than life, a dog who could sense danger before it happened, who had an uncanny ability to find people in need. But 10 years was a long time, and the rational part of Claire's mind told her that her father's wish was just a dying man's delusion. "Where would I even start?" she asked, her voice softer now. Sam's tone shifted, more serious. "Start with the woods where he disappeared. I'll meet you there." The woods were quieter than she remembered. The towering pines stretched upward like sentinels, their branches bare against the winter sky. The ground was hard and frozen beneath her boots, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. Claire parked her car at the trailhead and waited, her breath visible in the chilly air. Sam arrived shortly after, his truck rumbling to a stop beside her. He climbed out, his rugged face weathered by years of firefighting. He looked at her with a mix of warmth and concern. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said, pulling a flashlight from his pocket. "Didn't think I'd come," Claire admitted. Together, they ventured into the woods, their footsteps crunching against the frozen leaves. Sam led the way, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. Claire stayed close behind, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Your dad ever tell you what happened that night?" Sam asked, his voice low. "Only bits and pieces," Claire said. "He said Max ran off during the storm." Sam stopped and turned to face her. "There's more to it than that." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" Sam hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally he sighed. "Your dad didn't just lose Max that night. He lost a piece of himself. There was a rescue call earlier that day. A kid went missing out here. Max was the one who found him. Your dad never told anyone, but something happened after that. Something he's carried with him all these years." Claire's pulse quickened. "What happened?" Sam shook his head. "That's not for me to say, but if you find Max, you might get your answers." They pressed on, the woods growing darker and denser. Every rustle of leaves made Claire's heart jump, and the cold seemed to seep into her bones. She tried to push away the unease building inside her, but it only grew stronger as they reached the clearing where Max had last been seen. Sam stopped abruptly and pointed. "There!" Claire followed his gaze and froze. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the frozen earth, was a tattered red bandana. It looked eerily familiar, its fabric worn and faded, but unmistakably Max's. Her breath caught. "How is that possible?" Sam crouched, picking up the bandana and inspecting it. "It's been here a long time," he said quietly. "But it means he was here. Maybe not long ago." Claire felt a strange mix of hope and dread. The bandana was proof that Max had been alive, at least for a time. But where was he now? And why did she feel like finding him was about to uncover something far more complicated than a dog's disappearance? Claire stared at the bandana in Sam's hands, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and unease. The faded red fabric seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, a relic from a time when things were simpler, less fractured. She took a tentative step closer, reaching out to touch it. The cold fabric felt almost brittle under her fingers, as if it might disintegrate if she held on too tightly. "How does something like this survive out here for 10 years?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam stood, his expression unreadable. Maybe it didn't. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Claire turned to him, frowning. "What are you saying? That someone left it here recently? Who? And why?" "I don't know," Sam admitted, his voice gruff. "But things don't just stay untouched in woods like these. Someone, or something, wanted it to be found." The idea sent a shiver down Claire's spine. She scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows. The woods were eerily silent now, the only sound the crunch of frost underfoot. "What if we're chasing a ghost, Sam?" she asked, breaking the silence. "What if my dad's just imagining all this because he's scared to face the end?" Sam gave her a long, measured look. "You think your dad's the only one haunted by that night? Max wasn't just a dog, Claire. He had a way of knowing things he shouldn't have been able to know." "What are you talking about?" Claire demanded, frustration bubbling to the surface. Sam hesitated, his jaw tightening. "There's a reason your dad never talked about what happened that night. Max didn't just find that missing kid. He led your dad to something else, something he's been trying to forget ever since." Claire's breath hitched. "What did he find?" Sam shook his head. "That's not my story to tell. But I'll say this, whatever it was, it changed him. And it changed Max." Before Claire could press him further, a sudden noise cut through the stillness. It was faint but distinct, the snap of a twig followed by the unmistakable sound of movement. Both she and Sam froze, their heads whipping toward the source of the sound. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her heart pounding. Sam nodded, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on his belt. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice low. They moved cautiously toward the sound, the crunch of their footsteps barely audible over the thudding of Claire's heartbeat. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches casting twisted shadows on the forest floor. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by a low growl that sent a chill racing down Claire's spine. "Sam," she started, but before she could finish, something burst out from the underbrush, a blur of motion and sound. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. It was a dog, not Max, but close. Its fur was matted and dirty, its ribs visible beneath its patchy coat. It bared its teeth, growling low in its throat as it circled them warily, its eyes sharp and wild, locked onto Claire, and for a moment she couldn't move. "Easy now," Sam said softly, lowering himself into a crouch. He extended a hand toward the animal, his movements slow and deliberate. "We're not here to hurt you." The dog growled again but didn't retreat. Instead it sniffed the air, its eyes darting between Sam and Claire. Then, to Claire's astonishment, its gaze landed on the bandana in Sam's hand. The growl ceased, replaced by a low whine. The dog stepped closer, its movements hesitant but deliberate. Claire's chest tightened. "It recognizes it," she whispered. Sam nodded, his voice calm. Looks like we've found one of Max's pack. Claire blinked, confused. Pack? What are you talking about? Max wasn't alone out here, Sam said. Dogs don't survive for years on their own. They find others. They form packs. If this one knows the bandana, then Max is still out there. The idea filled Claire with a strange mix of hope and dread. She crouched down slowly, her hand outstretched toward the dog. It hesitated, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air between them. Finally it stepped closer, its wet nose brushing her fingertips. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice shaking. "You know where he is, don't you?" The dog barked suddenly, startling them both. Then it turned and bolted, darting into the woods like a shadow. Sam shot to his feet, grabbing Claire's arm. "Come on," he said urgently. "We have to follow it." Claire hesitated, her instincts screaming that this was a bad idea. But the sight of the bandana in Sam's hand and the sound of her father's frail voice echoing in her mind pushed her forward. They plunged into the trees, the cold biting at their faces as they ran after the fleeting silhouette. The woods seemed darker now, the light fading quickly. The dog stayed just out of reach, its movements swift and purposeful, as if it were leading them somewhere. Claire's lungs burned and her legs ached, but she didn't stop. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the dog stopped. It stood at the edge of a clearing, its body tense, its ears pricked. Claire and Sam slowed to a halt, panting heavily. "What's it doing?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the clearing ahead, his expression unreadable. Claire followed his line of sight and froze. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and its roof sagging with age. The dog barked once, then disappeared into the shadows of the trees, leaving them alone. Claire's stomach churned with unease. "What is this place?" Sam's voice was grim. "This is where your dad found the kid, and where he lost Max." Claire stared at the cabin, her heart pounding. The air felt heavier here, charged with something she couldn't explain. She took a step forward, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but she couldn't stop. Something was waiting for her inside, and she wasn't sure she wanted to find out what it was. The cabin loomed before them like a specter, its broken windows staring out into the forest like hollow eyes. A creeping sense of foreboding settled over Claire as she approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was colder here, the shadows darker, as if the clearing itself was reluctant to reveal its secrets. Sam stayed close, his flashlight cutting through the dim light as they reached the weathered door. The wood was warped and splintered, its surface scarred with deep grooves, almost as if clawed by something. Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the rusted handle. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sam's face was set in a grim expression. "This is the only lead we've got. If Max was here, we'll find something." Claire swallowed hard and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the silent forest. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the faint smell of decay lingering in the air. Dust motes danced in the beam of Sam's flashlight, revealing the remains of a once lived-in space. A rotting table sat in the center, its legs uneven and its surface covered in grime. The walls were lined with shelves, some of which still held rusted cans and shattered jars. As they stepped inside, the floor groaned beneath their weight. Claire's heart raced as she scanned the room, her eyes searching for anything that might explain why the dog had led them here. Her gaze fell on the far corner, where a tattered blanket lay crumpled on the floor. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong to the decay surrounding it. "Over there," she whispered, pointing. Sam moved toward the blanket cautiously, his flashlight steady. When he reached it, he crouched down and pulled the fabric aside. Beneath it lay a collection of objects, a broken collar, fragments of bone, and what appeared to be a rusted dog tag. Sam picked up the tag and turned it over in his hand. "Max," he murmured, his voice tinged with both relief and sadness. Claire knelt beside him, her eyes widening as she recognized the tag. "It's his," she said, her voice trembling. "But what's all this?" Sam's jaw tightened as he examined the scene. Looks like someone, or something, was keeping him here. But it doesn't explain why he left or why this place feels off. Before Claire could respond, a sound echoed from deeper within the cabin. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of movement. Her breath caught, and she instinctively grabbed Sam's arm. He held up a hand to signal silence, then rose to his feet, his flashlight aimed toward the source of the noise. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. They moved slowly toward the back of the cabin, where a narrow hallway stretched into darkness. The floor creaked with each step, the sound amplified in the stillness. The air grew colder, and Claire shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as they reached the end of the hall. A door stood ajar, its hinges rusted, and its surface marred with scratches. Sam pushed the door open with the tip of his flashlight, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, its floral pattern barely visible beneath layers of grime. In the center of the room was a crude wooden box, its lid slightly askew. "What the hell is this?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam didn't answer. He stepped forward and lifted the lid of the box, revealing its contents. Claire's stomach churned as she peered inside. The box was filled with photographs, old faded pictures of people and places she didn't recognize. Among them were images of dogs, some of which bore an unsettling resemblance to Max. "What is this?" she asked again, her voice rising with panic. Sam sifted through the photos, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but someone's been keeping these, and if Max was here, then whoever lived in this cabin knew about him." A sudden thud from the front of the cabin made them both freeze. Claire's heart leapt into her throat as she spun around, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone's here," she whispered. Sam motioned for her to stay quiet as he moved cautiously back toward the main room. The sound of footsteps echoed from outside, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent a chill racing down Claire's spine. She grabbed the nearest object, a rusted pipe from the floor, and followed Sam, her grip tight and her breath shallow. They reached the main room just in time to see the dog from earlier standing in the doorway. Its hackles were raised, its teeth bared as it snarled at something just beyond the threshold. Sam raised his flashlight, and its beam fell on a figure standing in the shadows outside. The figure stepped forward, and Claire's blood ran cold. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a hood. He carried himself with an air of menace, his movements deliberate and slow. The dog barked furiously, but the man didn't flinch. "Who are you?" Sam demanded, his voice firm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the bandana in Sam's hand, his finger trembling as if the sight of it enraged him. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving the dog barking in his wake. Claire's hands shook as she lowered the pipe. "What was that?" Sam didn't respond immediately. He stared after the man, his jaw clenched. Finally, he turned to Claire. "I think we just met the reason your dad never wanted to come back here." The man's sudden appearance and silent retreat left an oppressive weight hanging in the air. The dog continued barking, its growls reverberating through the cabin, until Sam crouched down and spoke softly. "Easy now, boy, he's gone." His calm tone eventually soothed the animal, and it backed away, its eyes still fixed on the doorway. Claire's hands were trembling as she set the rusted pipe on the floor. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam shook his head, his face dark with worry. "I don't know, but he knew exactly what he was looking for." Claire gestured toward the dog, her unease growing. "And what about this one? Why does it keep showing up and leading us places? It's like it wants something." Sam glanced at the dog, his expression thoughtful. "Dogs like this don't act without reason. They're too smart for that. He knows something we don't. Maybe he's trying to tell us where Max is, or what happened to him." Claire's stomach churned. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's behavior, the photos, and the man in the woods were all connected, threads in a tangled web she was only beginning to unravel. "What do we do now?" she asked. Sam sighed, the lines on his face deepening. "We need answers, and the only person who might have them is your dad." Back at the hospice, The tension was palpable as Claire and Sam entered John's room. John's condition had worsened since they had last seen him. His breathing was shallow, and his skin looked pale and waxy. His eyes fluttered open as they approached, and a weak smile crossed his lips when he saw them. "You found something," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Claire nodded, pulling the dog tag from her pocket and holding it out to him. "We found this. It was in an old cabin in the woods, along with some other things." John's gaze fixed on the tag, and his hand trembled as he reached for it. When his fingers closed around the metal, a tear slipped down his cheek. "Max," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Claire leaned closer, her voice urgent. "Dad, we also saw someone out there, a man. He didn't say anything, but he knew about the bandana. And the dog we've been following. It's like it's leading us somewhere." John's expression darkened, and he turned his head toward the window, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said after a long pause. "Why?" Claire demanded, her frustration bubbling over. "What are you not telling us? What happened in those woods, Dad?" John's eyes closed, and for a moment, Claire thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There are things out there that don't belong to this world. Max knew it. He always did. That cabin, it wasn't just a place where I found the boy. It was a warning." Sam and Claire exchanged a worried glance. "A warning about what?" Sam asked. John opened his eyes and fixed them on Claire, his gaze piercing despite his frailty. "The night Max disappeared, I heard something in those woods. Something that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever known. Max ran off to protect me. He always knew when danger was near. I followed him to that cabin, and that's where I found the boy. But there was something else there. Something watching us." Claire's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? Watching you how?" John's voice broke as he continued. "I don't know what it was, but I felt it. And Max did too. He stayed behind while I carried the boy back to safety. I waited for him to come back, but he never did. And I never had the courage to go back and look." The room fell silent, the weight of John's confession pressing down on all of them. Claire felt a mix of anger and sadness. Her father had spent the past decade haunted by a decision he had made in the heat of the moment, and now it was up to her to uncover the truth. Sam broke the silence. "If there's something out there, we need to know what it is, and we need to find Max." John shook his head weakly. "You don't understand. Some things are better left buried. If Max is still out there, he's not the same. He can't be." Claire felt a chill run down her spine, but she squared her shoulders. "I don't believe that. Max was more than just a dog, wasn't he? He was a protector, and he'd never stop protecting you, or anyone else he cared about." John didn't respond. His breathing grew shallower, and the nurse entered the room to adjust his oxygen. Claire turned to Sam, her voice low but determined. "We're going back out there. We're going to find Max, and we're going to find out what really happened." Sam nodded, his jaw set. "Let's just hope we're ready for what we find." The drive back to the woods was silent, the weight of John's confession hanging heavily between Claire and Sam. The road wound through the darkened forest, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the car as they passed. Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with questions. What had her father meant about Max not being the same? What had he seen in those woods all those years ago? The dog sat in the back seat, its eyes fixed out the window, as if it too sensed the gravity of their mission. Its presence was both comforting and unnerving, its behavior too deliberate to be mere coincidence. When they reached the trailhead, the dog leaped out of the car before Claire or Sam could react, its body tense as it sniffed the air. Claire glanced at Sam, her unease mirrored in his expression. "Do you think it knows where it's going?" she asked, her voice low. Sam shrugged. "If it's been leading us this far, I don't see why it would stop now." They followed the dog into the woods, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The forest was unnervingly silent, the usual rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets replaced by an oppressive stillness. The air was colder than it had been earlier, and Claire pulled her coat tighter around her as they walked. The dog moved with purpose, its nose close to the ground as it weaved through the trees. It stopped occasionally to sniff at the air, its ears swiveling as if listening for something. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time she turned to look behind her, there was nothing but shadows. "Sam," she said softly, "do you feel that?" He nodded without breaking stride. "Yeah, like the whole forest is holding its breath." The dog suddenly stopped, its body rigid as it stared into the darkness ahead. It let out a low growl, the sound deep and guttural, and Claire's pulse quickened. "What is it?" she whispered, her flashlight aimed in the same direction. Before Sam could respond, the dog bolted, disappearing into the shadows. Claire cursed under her breath and ran after it, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she dodged tree roots and low-hanging branches. Sam was close behind her, his heavier footsteps crunching against the frozen leaves. The dog led them to another clearing, smaller than the one with the cabin, but no less eerie. In the center stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. At the base of the tree was a shallow depression in the ground, the dirt disturbed as if something had recently been dug up. Claire stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. "What is this place?" Sam stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the ground. "Looks like someone or something was here recently." The dog circled the tree, whining softly as it sniffed at the disturbed earth. Claire's heart pounded as she moved closer, her flashlight revealing something partially buried in the dirt. She crouched down and brushed the loose soil away with trembling hands, her stomach twisting as the object came into view. It was another collar, similar to the one John had kept on his nightstand. This one was newer, its leather still supple and its metal tag shiny despite the dirt. Claire's breath hitched as she read the name engraved on it. "Max," she whispered, her voice shaking. Sam knelt beside her, his expression grim. "It's his. But why would it be here?" Claire looked up at the tree, her flashlight tracing the jagged scars that ran up its trunk. The bark was torn and splintered, as if clawed by something desperate to escape. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. "We need to dig," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Sam hesitated. "Are you sure?" "We don't know what we're going to find." Claire nodded, her jaw set. "If Max was here, I need to know." They found branches and began digging at the disturbed earth, the cold biting at their hands. The dog watched silently, its body tense as it paced around the clearing. The dirt gave way easily, as if whatever had been buried there wanted to be found. After several minutes of digging, their tools struck something solid. Claire's heart raced as she brushed the remaining soil away, revealing a wooden box, its surface worn and splintered. She hesitated for a moment, then pried the lid open. Inside was a collection of objects that sent a chill racing down her spine. Photographs of John with Max, letters written in her father's unmistakable handwriting, and what appeared to be old maps of the forest, marked with symbols she didn't recognize. But what caught her attention most was a single folded piece of paper resting on top. She picked it up and unfolded it carefully, her hands shaking as she read the words scrawled across it. "Max was right. I should have listened. If you found this, you're already too close. Leave now, before it's too late." Claire's blood ran cold as the words sank in. She looked up at Sam, her voice barely audible. "He knew. My dad knew something was out here." Before Sam could respond, the dog let out a sudden, sharp bark, its body rigid as it stared into the darkness. Claire followed its gaze and froze. Two glowing eyes were watching them from the shadows, unblinking and eerily calm. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the glowing eyes remained fixed on them, their otherworldly light cutting through the darkness. Sam rose slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he aimed it toward the source. The beam illuminated the trees, but the eyes didn't flinch or move. They seemed to hover, disembodied, watching with an unsettling calm. The dog growled low, stepping protectively in front of Claire. Its fur bristled, and it let out a sharp bark that echoed through the clearing. Claire tightened her grip on the collar she had found, her pulse racing. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sam didn't answer immediately. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on the glowing orbs. "Whatever it is," he said finally, "it's not afraid of us." The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Claire could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears as she stepped back, her legs feeling like lead. The glowing eyes shifted slightly, and for the first time, Claire caught a glimpse of the creature behind them. It was massive, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees. Its body seemed to blend with the shadows, its movements fluid and unnatural. It let out a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver racing down her spine. Sam raised his hand, motioning for Claire to stay behind him. "Don't run," he said quietly. "Whatever you do, don't run." The creature took a step forward, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. Its fur was dark and matted, its limbs impossibly long, and its face. Claire couldn't quite process what she was seeing. It was canine, but not entirely. Its eyes glowed with an intelligence that felt too human, too aware. The dog barked again, stepping closer to the creature, its body tense but unwavering. Claire reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the dog's back as if to pull it back to safety. "What's it doing?" she whispered, panic rising in her voice. Sam's voice was steady, but his words were grim. "It's trying to protect us." Before Claire could respond, the creature let out a bone-chilling growl and lunged forward. The dog met it halfway, its body colliding with the shadowy form in a flurry of movement and sound. Claire screamed, stumbling backward, as Sam grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the edge of the clearing. "We have to go," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "But the dog—" Claire started, her voice breaking. "There's nothing we can do for it," Sam snapped, his grip firm. "We have to get out of here." Reluctantly, Claire let him pull her away, her legs moving on autopilot as they ran through the forest. The sounds of the struggle faded behind them, replaced by the pounding of their footsteps and the ragged sound of their breathing. Claire's mind raced, torn between fear for their lives and guilt for leaving the dog behind. They didn't stop until they reached the trailhead, their bodies trembling from exertion and adrenaline. Sam bent over, his hands on his knees as he struggled to catch his breath. Claire leaned against a tree, her chest heaving, her mind replaying the events in the clearing over and over. "What was that thing?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Sam straightened, his expression grim. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it wasn't natural. And whatever it was, it's been out here for a long time." Claire clenched her fists, anger and fear warring within her. "We can't just leave the dog. It led us there. It tried to protect us. We owe it." A sudden rustling in the bushes cut her off, and both she and Sam turned, their flashlights aimed toward the sound. For a moment neither of them moved, their bodies tense with anticipation. Then, to Claire's astonishment, the dog emerged from the underbrush. It was limping, its fur matted with blood, but it was alive. "Oh my God," Claire whispered, dropping to her knees as the dog approached. "You made it." The dog whimpered softly, collapsing at her feet. She reached out, her hands shaking as she stroked its fur. "You're okay," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You're okay." Sam knelt beside her, his brow furrowed as he examined the dog's injuries. "It's hurt, but not too badly. Whatever that thing was, it let it go." Claire looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Why would it do that?" Sam didn't answer immediately. He glanced back toward the forest, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it wasn't after the dog. Maybe it was after something else. Claire's stomach twisted at the thought. She looked down at the dog, its eyes half closed but still alert. It had led them here, to the clearing, to the cabin, to the buried box. It had risked its life for them. And now it was looking at her with an intensity that made her feel as though it was trying to tell her something. "What do you want us to do?" she whispered, her fingers brushing the dog's collar. The dog let out a low whine, its gaze flicking toward the forest. Claire followed its line of sight, her heart sinking. It was leading them back into the darkness, back to whatever it was that had been watching them. Sam placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady. "We don't have to do this," he said quietly. "We can leave. We can tell your dad we tried. That we couldn't find anything. Claire shook her head, her jaw set. Number, this isn't just about my dad anymore. This is about Max. About the truth. Whatever's out there, we have to face it. Sam sighed, his expression a mix of frustration and admiration. Then we'd better be ready for whatever comes next. The forest seemed even darker as they re-entered, the towering trees closing in around them like the ribs of a beast. The dog led the way, limping but determined, its eyes scanning the shadows as if it could see something they could not. Claire gripped the flashlight tightly, her other hand clutching the collar she had found. It felt like a talisman now, a fragile link to the truth buried somewhere in these woods. Sam walked beside her, his jaw clenched and his movements deliberate. The tension in the air was suffocating, and neither of them spoke as they followed the dog deeper into the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made Claire flinch, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. They reached a narrow path, overgrown and barely visible beneath the fallen leaves. The dog stopped and looked back at them, its eyes full of urgency. It barked once, then continued forward, disappearing into the dense underbrush. Claire hesitated for a moment before following, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. The path led them to another clearing, smaller than the first, but somehow even more unsettling. In the center stood an ancient stone well, its surface covered in moss and vines. The air around it felt different, heavier, colder, charged with an energy that made Claire's skin prickle. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam approached the well cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over its surface. "Looks old, really old. Maybe it's been here longer than anything else in these woods." Claire stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the well. The dog sat beside it, its body tense and its eyes fixed on the darkness within. She swallowed hard, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close. She peered over the edge of the well, her flashlight revealing nothing but blackness. The air rising from it was damp and stale, carrying a faint metallic smell that made her stomach churn. "There's something down there," she said, her voice trembling. Sam frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Claire admitted, stepping back, "but I can feel it. Something's wrong." The dog barked suddenly, startling them both. It pawed at the ground near the well, its movements frantic. Claire knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she brushed away the leaves and dirt. Beneath the surface, she found a rusted metal hatch, its edges crusted with moss. "Help me," she said, looking up at Sam. He hesitated for a moment, then joined her, their combined strength barely enough to pry the hatch open. The metal groaned in protest, and a rush of cold air escaped as the hatch finally gave way, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into the earth. Claire's flashlight illuminated the first few steps, but the darkness beyond swallowed the light. She looked at Sam, her pulse racing. "We have to go down." Sam's jaw tightened. "Are you sure about this?" "No," she admitted. "But I can't walk away now." Sam nodded, his expression grim. "Then let's get this over with." They descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The dog followed closely, its body tense and its ears pricked. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the echo of their footsteps amplifying the oppressive silence. Claire's flashlight flickered, and she gripped it tighter, her heart pounding. At the bottom, they found themselves in a cavernous space, the walls slick with moisture, and the air thick with the metallic smell that had haunted them since the well. In the center of the room stood a large, jagged stone altar, its surface stained with something dark and unidentifiable. "What the hell is this?" Sam muttered, his voice echoing off the walls. Claire's stomach twisted as she approached the altar. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, their shapes unfamiliar and unsettling. Her eyes fell on a small object resting at the center of the altar, a bone clean and white, its shape unmistakably that of a canine. Her breath hitched. "Max." The dog let out a low whine, its body trembling as it stared at the bone. Claire's hand shook as she reached for it, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. A sudden wave of cold swept through the cavern, and the flashlight flickered again, plunging them into momentary darkness. When the light returned, the atmosphere had changed. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker. Claire turned to Sam, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Sam opened his mouth to respond, but a deep, guttural growl cut him off. It wasn't the dog. It came from the shadows, a sound so primal and menacing that it made Claire's blood run cold. The dog barked furiously, its body rigid as it faced the source of the sound. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the cavern. Claire's flashlight flickered again, and this time, it revealed something moving in the darkness. The creature from the woods stepped into the light, its massive form looming over them. Its eyes glowed brighter than before, and its teeth gleamed as it bared them in a snarl. Claire stumbled back, her mind racing. The creature moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The dog barked and lunged at it, but the creature swatted it away effortlessly, sending it crashing into the wall. "Run!" Sam shouted, grabbing Claire's arm and pulling her toward the staircase. They scrambled up the steps, the sound of the creature's growls echoing behind them. The air grew colder with each step, the oppressive energy following them like a shadow. Claire's legs burned, her chest heaving as she pushed herself to keep going. They burst out of the well, gasping for air, and slammed the hatch shut behind them. The dog limped out moments later, its fur matted with dirt but otherwise unharmed. The growls faded, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the clearing. Claire collapsed to her knees, her body shaking as she clutched the collar in her hands. Sam stood nearby, his flashlight aimed at the hatch, his face pale and drawn. "What was that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Sam didn't answer immediately. He looked down at her, his expression grave. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's been waiting down there for a long time." Claire stared at the collar, her mind racing. She thought of her father, of Max, of the years of silence and the guilt that had consumed him. She thought of the creature, of its glowing eyes and the dark energy that had radiated from it. She looked at the dog, its eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It barked once, then turned and began walking toward the forest, its movements slow but purposeful. "It's not over," Claire said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "It's not over." Sam nodded, his jaw tight. "Number. It's just beginning."